My name's Robbie Hember, and I'm going to present an overview of the research focusing on involved in theme 2 of this collaborative project involving environmental impacts on forest productivity in British Columbia. So this morning we heard about efforts to develop mitigation portfolios that are aimed at keeping carbon out of the atmosphere using forest management. And theme 2 follows from that with the recognition that we also need to be concerned about how the climate system and environmental changes generally will impact forest health and productivity, and how that will influence the effectiveness of these mitigation portfolios. So one of the first things we did was developed a big picture summary of what we think the environmental impacts have been on forest growth and mortality. And we did this nationally using field plots collected by provincial agencies and industries across the country. And we used that data to develop statistical models that relate environmental variables against forest growth and mortality. This is one of the biggest studies of its kind. We were able to use over 37,000 measurements in British Columbia and over 60,000 measurements across the rest of Canada. We summarized our results at the level of ecozones, so calculating ecozone average time trends in forest growth and mortality. And a lot of effort was put into specifically attributing the component of those trends associated with environmental change. What we found is that in the humid ecozones, for example, on the west coast of Canada and other humid ecozones, we estimated significant positive trends in growth or growth enhancement. However, we also found that in the drier west central ecozones of Canada, that the growth enhancement was substantially muted or even canceled out. And then for mortality, we found pretty much the opposite pattern, where there wasn't much of no significant time trend in mortality and significant increases in mortality in the drier regions. And so a major conclusion for British Columbia is that there's weakened growth enhancement in British Columbia's interior regions and also increasing tree mortality. So that's a great big picture summary to have, but forest managers and carbon cycle modelers require much more detailed information about environmental impacts, in particular on specific commercial tree species. And we've already touched on how important the site variation is. So in a more detailed study, we focused on the issue of drought-related tree mortality. And in this particular case, what that involved is taking all the data for a specific tree species. And we did this for many species across North America. And for each species, then developing what we've referred to as drought vulnerability curves. And so these simply relate the probability of tree mortality with common hydrological variables. And that allowed us to investigate some important covariates, other factors that tend to influence the vulnerability of a tree to drought. For example, we found that the size or the height of the trees has an important influence on the vulnerability to drought. And we also found things like the location of that tree within the species distribution can also mediate its vulnerability, implying a certain degree of genetic variation within the species. So that's the kind of information we really need to know confidently in order to design mitigation portfolios that target locations that we know will have high productivity. When we take all those species and summarize what happened to the probability of mortality over time for about 6 decades over the historical period, what we found is that the probability of mortality has been increasing over time, and that it's not just a gradual increase in the background rate of mortality, but it's also an increase in the frequency and intensity of these extreme mortality years, which are attributed to extreme regional droughts. And these are areas that we think are very important for capturing this level of mortality, because they likely devastate the forest in a specific region, and that has carryover effects for the forest sector for decades. So we also, in addition to things like drought-related mortality, need to consider positive effects of various global change factors. For example, increasing carbon dioxide concentration would be one of those. Carbon is a primary building block for plants, and they get that carbon from the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so it's been long hypothesized that the increasing CO2 in the atmosphere will enhance the growth rate of these trees. So we did this using statistical models, and this is a comparison, the green showing our results developed from statistical models that are fitted to observations in the field over the historical range of carbon dioxide concentration, showing the relative response to CO2, compared with a compilation of experimental findings from other studies that have enriched trees with CO2 at a much higher level. And what we find from this is that there's a very good consistency between the two independent sources of evidence. And there's two major findings here. They're consistent in that, on average, the growth rates increase with increasing atmospheric CO2. But both lines of evidence also suggest that the variation around that mean, the shading around those curves, is gigantic. It's greater than the mean itself. So we really, to have any success at this, we need to understand why that is and be able to predict where CO2 is going to have a positive effect and where it's not going to have a positive effect. And that kind of information is pretty powerful. So we had more data than anybody has previously had to look at this question, and it afforded us the opportunity to break down, looking at those statistical models in more detail, to break down the area for any given species, to look at the area where CO2 is having a positive effect and where it's not having a positive effect. And if we look at that area to understand where CO2 is not having a positive effect, to understand in more detail why, what we find is that there's all sorts of reasons to explain why. Sometimes the temperature is too high, sometimes the atmosphere is too dry for that species, or it's too humid for that species, sometimes the soil water is not optimal, and sometimes the nitrogen is not an adequate supply to support further growth enhancement. None of this is incredibly shocking to people, for example, in agriculture. They've kind of known this stuff for decades, but quantifying the effects and mapping it for commercial tree species remains a major challenge. Basically because even though we have lots of data to work with, it's probably, it certainly needs to be increased and sustained into the future to constrain these kinds of numbers. And in particular, to put a face on this by mapping it across a species distribution. So that's an example of one of the global change factors that we need to consider, and we need to consider it because it's happening everywhere. So the magnitude of the impacts on forest productivity are huge. But forest managers also require information pertaining to local scale variation and growth. So within a forest management unit, we know that the aspect of the terrain can have a major impact on forest productivity, and elevation can have an important impact. And as simple as that sounds, modeling this level of variation can be a challenge. So we have been busy trying to incorporate not just global change factors, but also this local scale variation using terrain variables at a high resolution. And when we do that, we have a fair degree of success predicting growth rates and how they vary over local scales. So this is a nice aerial shot of predicted growth over the Fraser River Canyon in central British Columbia, showing the differences between high growth rates in the valleys and low growth rates towards the tree line, or towards the forest grassland ecotone. Okay, so just to recap, we've developed a big picture summary of what we believe to be the environmental impacts on forest growth and mortality. We did that at the scale of ecozones, and we did it based on observations, which is fairly rare in our field. We secondly have started to advance the capacity to predict environmental impacts on trees, addressing these key questions facing British Columbia, for example, the drought vulnerability of our species, the impact of global change factors, and local scale variation. And just to finish it off, we'll look at our current, moving forward, what our plans are is to try and bring all of this together. That is combining environmentally sensitive, species-specific models of growth and mortality to incorporate that information into estimates of the long-term changes in forest biomass in British Columbia. So this is an example of the simulations we're starting to do, looking at stands leading with lodgepole pine, and the types of simulations we get out of this, trying to achieve a more complete expression of forest health indicators by combining information on stand replacing disturbances that are provided to us from forest inventories with a certain amount of tree mortality that needs to be modeled. So these are partial disturbances that can have a huge impact, but are still very hard to account for in our models, all the way down to the background rates of mortality, which also could have fundamental influences on future plans if they were to shift by even a small amount. And then finally, using that information, incorporating that information into the carbon budget model to predict the forest carbon cycle within a probabilistic framework that accounts for variation in future emissions scenarios, variation in climate model simulations, and variation in ecosystem responses or the behavior of tree species. Thank you very much.